Well, I'm going to start by saying thank you to Sandra, because we've been trying to make this happen for, I think, 3 years. So thanks to Sandra and the friends for not giving up on us, because we're excited. When I said I was going to do a memoir in poetry, I thought that sounded like a really neat idea. I still think it's a neat idea. I also think it's probably a little impossible. It immediately became impossible because I've been reading and writing long enough that I have so many favorite poems and so many poets that have been important to me as people I've read, and in some cases, people I've actually studied with. So the whole process to begin with was saying, no, you, not you, not you. And that meant saying, not for today, to some of my very, very favorite people. What I'm going to do is read, in most cases, one poem and give a little introduction to the poet and how I came to know about them. And then I'll say just a few things about the individual poem. But the main purpose is to share with you poems that have been influences on me in the sense of really flowing into my consciousness and whatever my thinking is in poetry. And I'm not trying to draw any straight lines between my own work and the work of these people. But these are people who have been important and remain really important to me right now. What I really value about these poems is they have emotional intensity. They all have an intense use of language in different ways, that the images connect the inner and the outer worlds of our experience. I love musical line breaks and spaces and a coherent narrative structure, or not narrative structure, but a coherent structure. So I can say that's, I think all these illustrate that. And where I started with all this was in the late 70s, living in Park Slope, Brooklyn, and starting to write things that I began to realize sort of were not prose. They weren't anything that I could recognize. They were poems. And after I'd been doing that very intensely on my own for a couple of years, it did occur to me that maybe I could learn something to help me do this. So I called up the only poet I knew at the time, and that was Joan Larkin, whose work you're probably familiar with, many of you. And she was a friend of ours in Park Slope. She was extremely sympathetic, and she said, well, you see, today I just interviewed for the radio a poet, a wonderful poet named Jean Valentine, and she seems from the interview as if she would be a very, very good teacher. She is one of the great teachers, so I was very, very lucky. So I worked with her for several years. And I'm going to read a poem of Jean's that's an older poem, but as all her poems do, it's very, very meticulous in its use of language. It's deeply, deeply serious in the way every word is placed and the way the spaces occur in the poem. It deals very, very quietly with a large number of possible relationships, all within one poem. It's a gentle voice, it's a very tender voice, and a very precise voice. So here is a poem by Jean Valentine called Outside the Frame. Are you hearing me okay in the back? Yeah, all right, good. Outside the frame. It is enough now, anywhere, with everyone you love there to talk to, and to listen. Slowly we can tell each other some things about our lives, runs, rests, brief resolutions, falls and lulls, hard, joyful runs in certainty, dull, sweet durances, human silences. Look back in at the children, the regular, neutral flicker of their blood, pale, solemn, long-legged animal gods in their sleep, growing into their lives in their sleep. So round about this time, I was starting to hear about people that it would be interesting to study with. And one of the people I studied with who shared an awful lot of poetry with me, it was Robert Bly. And if you've never been in the night in the Maine woods and been woken up in the middle of the night by beautiful singing outside your extremely humble cabin, and then taken through the dark to a room in which everybody in the room is being persuaded to say the name of a dead family member over and over, you really haven't had a good time in life. I mean, I can hear the people singing outside the door. Robert is a great social force in certain ways, and a fine poet, and he's introduced me to an awful lot of work of other people, including Thomas Tranströmer, who is a deep favorite of mine, and a few other million people. Swedish poet, died just a few years ago. I go back to him and back to him. There's a kind of a comfort in being a human being at all in Tranströmer's work. There's always two worlds, balance, 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 inner world and outer world, in the present moment. I'm going to read the first section of Baltics, which is a prose poem that's actually in 6 parts. I'll just read the first part. And the fog in Baltics is actual weather, very much actual weather. It's based on the facts of his grandfather's life, and his grandfather was a captain on the Baltic. So the fog is both weather and also a momentary clouded perception that could have killed them all. And that's very typical of Tranströmer's work. The subject matter is extremely meaningful to me because my mother's family were all from the North Shore of Boston, from Gloucester, Massachusetts. My grandfather and my great-grandfather were men who made their livings on the sea and fish, and my great-grandfather was a pretty famous captain out of Gloucester. So the Baltic is not the Atlantic, but it's very meaningful. The translator here, because Tranströmer, of course, wrote in Swedish, is Patty Crane. And I'd also like to thank and apologize in advance to my Swedish coach for some of the names, Leo Treitler, who does speak Swedish, and I'm going to try. So here is Baltics 1. It was before the time of radio towers. Grandfather was a new pilot. In the almanac, he wrote down the ships he guided, names, destinations, drafts. Examples from 1884. SS Tiger, Captain Rowan, 16 feet, Hull Göfle Föresund. Brig Ocean, Captain Anderson, 8 foot. Sandofjord Henresund Farazand. SS St. Petersburg, Captain Libeneg, 11 foot. Stettin Lebu Sandam. He took them out to the Baltic through the wonderful labyrinth of islands and water, and those who met on board and were carried by the same hull for a few hours or days, how well did they get to know each other? Conversations in misspelled English, understanding and misunderstanding, but very little deliberate lying. How well did they get to know each other? When the fog was thick, half speed, nearly blind, out of the invisible, the point appeared, and in a single stride was right on them, horn bellowing every 2 minutes. His eyes read straight into the invisible. Did he have the labyrinth in his head? The minutes passed, shallows and rocks memorized like palm verses, and that feeling of, we're right here, that must be held, the way you carry a brimming pot so nothing gets spilled. A glance down into the engine room. The compound engine, long lived like a human heart, worked with large, smooth, recoiling movements, steel acrobats, and the smells rose as if from a kitchen. I don't know how I met Denise Levertov's work, but once I did, it was absolutely first love. I inhaled her. I still go back to her. Some of her essays about writing still have tremendous meaning to me, and people who studied with me know I can get really kind of obsessive about what's the pause at the end of a line? Is it a comma? Is it a half comma? I mean, you can get really worked up about that, you know. And I do. Thanks, Sandra. So let me just read Come into Animal Presence. Come into animal presence. No man is so guileless as the serpent. The lonely white rabbit on the roof is a star, twitching its ears at the rain. The llama, intricately folding its hind legs to be seated, not disdains, but mildly disregards human approval. What joy when the insouciant armadillo glances at us and doesn't quicken his trotting across the track into the palm brush. What is this joy? That no animal falters, but knows what it must do. That the snake has no blemish, that the rabbit inspects his strange surroundings in white star silence. The llama rests in dignity. The armadillo has some intention to pursue in the palm forest. Those who were sacred have remained so. Holiness does not dissolve. It is a presence of bronze. Only the sight that saw it faltered and turned from it. An old joy returns in holy presence. I love the surprising list of animals. I mean, who would do a serpent, a rabbit, a llama? You know, they're just unusual. I love the descriptive words that are used. Guileless, intricately. She was English, although she spent most of her adult life in America, and so some of the diction is very, very English, and it is very serious in its intentions. The criticism of us as a human race is gentle. She is including all of us. So without more ado, I'm going to read two poems by Louise Glick. Back in, I don't know, 90s sometime, I took a workshop with the Poetry Society of America with Jill Bielowski, and the purpose of the workshop was to learn how to put a manuscript together. And our text for the course was Louise Glick's Ararat, which is, if you care about such things, a manuscript that is put together like mortar and bricks. I mean, it's just really, really solid. I had read some of her work before, but not much. I'm going to read Lost Love from that manuscript, and then I'm going to read The Wild Iris, the title poem from the book, the collection of that name. They have things in common. They both have a good deal of suffering and regeneration in them. They also, they have that very, very strong voice of hers, which is sometimes so strong it makes you want to say, you know, put 'em up. I'm going to take you on. But it's very, very powerful voice. So here is Lost Love. My sister spent a whole life in the earth. She was born, she died. In between, not one alert look, not one sentence. She did what babies do. She cried, but she didn't want to be fed. Still, my mother held her, trying to change first fate, then history. Something did change. When my sister died, my mother's heart became very cold, very rigid, like a tiny pendant of iron. Then it seemed to me my sister's body was a magnet. I could feel it draw my mother's heart into the earth so it would grow. It's just an image that packed a long time ago, and it still does. Here's the Wild Iris. In Lost Love, of course, that's a first-person narrative. She was speaking presumably for herself. The Wild Iris is an actual iris speaking, and we can hear Louise Glick speaking too. The Wild Iris. At the end of my suffering, there was a door. Hear me out. That which you call death, I remember. Overhead, noises, branches of the pine shifting, then nothing. The weak sun flickered over the dry surface. It is terrible to survive as consciousness buried in the dark earth. Then it was over, that which you fear, being a soul and unable to speak, ending abruptly, the stiff earth bending a little, and what I took to be birds darting in low shrubs. You who do not remember passage from the other world, I tell you I could speak again. Whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. From the center of my life came a great fountain, deep blue shadows on azure seawater. I heard about Irish poet Maeve McGuckian from a friend of mine who had very strong connections to Ireland, and so I went to hear her read at NYU, I think, and she arrived late for the reading. She was in extremely grumpy mood, which meant she was but I found her poems absolutely riveting, and I still do. The Still Life of Eggs, which I'm about to read, is, first of all, amazingly, it flows on and on. It's an almost liquid voice, but in point of fact, it's a sonnet. It piles on similes, it's highly metaphorical. Her friend Sylvia was the dedicee, is compared to, in this short poem, a diagonal shoreline, a painting, the top story of a house, and a stone. And this is presumably a friendly tribute to Sylvia. So here is Maeve McGuckian's Still Life of Eggs. You are almost kneeling a diagonal shoreline between two harbors in the house-fostered darkness. The tilt of your head reflects the arc of the tablecloth, the curve of the sea. And if the weather could fling its reds, greens, blues, and purples across the tabletops, thought upon the unthinking, the blue might stay a river or a lake, the fraying edges fog. Like the beginning of a painting, you have been so watched, like an additional story squeezed into a sharp roof. You freeze the forever ripening shadows under your eyebrows and neck into younger stone, contained, containing, perfectly alone. I love it that the turn of the sonnet, the hinge in the middle of it, is in parentheses, thought upon the unthinking. It's a little bit heady, but it's neat. I went to a reading at the 92nd Street Y to hear a Russian poet, Irina Ratushinskaya, whom I admired a great deal at the time, and the second reader, whom I'd never heard of, was Adam Zagajewski. And I was completely blown out of the water by the inclusiveness of his poems, the quiet voice of his poems. He's unafraid of history. He celebrates a very, very complex historical reality. And the speaker in his poems is always very, very present in the poems, but the poems do not focus on him or his inner psyche. He's an observant participant in history. So I'm going to try and read a poem called The Creation of the World. And I'll tell you that the creation of the world covers a couple of days and nights, and a great deal happened during the creation of the world. So it's got, which is typical of his longer poems, it has sort of some huge lists of things. So if you could just sort of roll with it and see where it takes you. I'm going to read a very few poems of my own. The creation of the world. Mornings, curled asleep in our soft beds and in history, cruel, sluggish, dark rings under its eyes, mint leaves on its oh so weary lids. Mornings, birds impatiently strut on the sill and call us to action. Furious doves who hid behind curtains shriek in hollow Mozartian tones. It exists, it's being built, in the meadow and forest and next to the pond, where the odor of dry willow hovers and a lark bathes in a puddle. Up, quick, the rooster is running, leaning forward like a sprinter. Dawn blushes, owls depart without a goodbye. The insurgent flag of the darkness is fading. Again silence falls, the great performance delays, again sleep, darkness, the void, nothingness, lack of presence, its specific slumbering pleasure. Now rain dictates a long, tedious lecture, and typewriters hidden in garrets lazily clack their humid spellings out, slow, hesitant, like a small nation's unconfident leader. But now the rain falls silent, the gardens resume their chanting. They sing from the depths of their brimming green hearts, arbors and trees, the core of their leaves. A blackbird appears in the void, perfect, full of pride, as all living creatures are proud of their endless warm virtues. Dew scatters on the grass. Each hard drop is a whole, closed in itself like a planet. A grass snake is suddenly here, then a roe deer, a reindeer, an ash, a black poplar. Evil contents itself for the moment with its stinging trope of nettles. Suddenly newer and newer fauna evolves, and new countries, wars, short waves, long waves, the axe, the gramophone record. Trolleys ring their great school bell for a recess. Clouds swim on their backs, gazing calmly at the sun. At last you awake, though God made man first, really woman is older. There'll be storms, abrupt dusks under leaden, too heavy clouds. There'll be hail, frozen tears, long journeys in quiet trains. But not every thunderbolt kills. Not every death means an ending. Not every speech missing means silence. Here is a very recent poem of my own. It's framed as a dream, but it's very much placed in a very actual place, which is a place where I spent every summer of my childhood from the time I was 7 till I was 18 and left home for good. So here's Dream Beside Salt Water. A sandbar in the river, a sandbar in a tidal river. Borders shift, location changes slightly. The deep boat channel stays in place. Under bare soles, the bars firm and cool, crumbly as a pile of sugar. Tawny pale, rounded hummocks, muddy mica where the water rustles in. Sand grains extend in a loose horseshoe from shore to a far double tip downriver. Incoming tide breaks the bar into islands. Wade from one country to another. Wait too long, you swim. The idea floats, carries childhood and my horses through the long dream. I'm going to end with 2 short poems for 2 people who are extremely tall in my life. My grandsons. The first poem is called Zipping Past, and it's for Emmett, already 3. Well, he'll be 11 next month, so, you know, just make that clear. Zipping past. You scratch and pull at zigzag cotton prints, grab and stare at black dashes in a white bowl. With your blue eyes more serious than language, you send your smile into mine. On socks small as my thumb, pointed stars sing as you study how light finds an entrance. Your lion bathrobe with tawny round ears on the hood, and the t-shirt where dolphins bump heads, crumpled on the bathroom floor. Leaving your infant shadow behind, you outgrow yourself. And Ring of Candles was for Augie on his 6th birthday, and he is 10, so Ring of Candles. Buttery, slithery, slides into my arms to hug. Augie's every cell heart-shaped. Foot to foot shifts his weight, displaying those sassy hips, wearing a carpenter's belt or silver mesh tights. What a dresser. I look under those thick double eyelashes into luminous plans. His stiff bristled paintbrush oozes color. Oh, Augie, paint me in with you. Thank you.